Much of the things that Trump does is make dramatic moves that garner huge headlines that ultimately have no impact on the ground. This is the product of a very specific vendetta against Harvard in particular. This is just short-sighted policy in an attempt to bully, a generally great institution.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is a bit different. It's urgent, it's emotional, and it affects thousands of students worldwide. Earlier this week, the Trump administration attempted to revoke Harvard's ability to enroll international students. To help us break this down, I'm joined by someone who's been following this situation very closely, Joel Butterly. Hi, Joel. It's a pleasure to have you join us today.
Hi, Jillian. Great to be here.
Joel, so before we dive into details, can you take a moment to introduce yourself and share a bit about the lens through which you're approaching this moment?
Sure. As you said, my name is Joel Butterly. I'm the co-founder and CEO of InGenius Prep, which we started in 2013. So a while back now. My background, I went to Dartmouth College. After that, I went to Yale Law School and very briefly tinkered with the idea of becoming a lawyer, which ultimately I decided not to do. But I did graduate from Yale Law in 2017. And so my kind of thought process on this is influenced by multiple experiences, one of which is my legal education. The other of which is I've spent a great deal of time traveling the world and proselytizing international education, helping students all over the world gain entry to elite universities in the US and Canada and the UK, other countries as well. And so I see this as both kind of a legal question, a kind of practical question, as well as an emotional one, how to deal with the anxiety around this issue.
So, Joel, as I've mentioned, I'm sure you've been following the news very closely about Harvard's SEVP certification. Can you walk us through what exactly happened and why do you think it's happening now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of theories going around. At its highest level, Trump seems very intent on squeezing Harvard in particular. And so the levers that he has been pulling started with cutting key funding for research, which is undoubtedly harmful not only to graduate students, but the institutions and frankly, the entire country, because a lot of critical R&D is happening at places like Harvard. Secondly, by floating the prospect of taxing Harvard's endowment or threatening its nonprofit status. And then most recently, by trying to deprive Harvard of international students, which, if listeners don't know, there are 1.1 million approximately international students studying in the United States. They almost always pay full tuition. They are responsible for over $55 billion of spending in the United States annually, which is to say it's quite a large industry, but also many of our institutions of higher learning are financially dependent on those full pay students. Perhaps not Harvard with its relatively large endowment, but many institutions are. And so anything that is threatening to international students is at one institution is taken as a threat to many other institutions' lifeblood. It seems to be clear that Trump has a very particular vendetta against Harvard for one reason or the other. And so at this point, what they're really trying to do is showcase that they can force Harvard to comply, and they are doing everything in their power to compel that or coerce that by squeezing it financially.
Thanks for setting up that scene for us. I think it's easy for us to get swept up in the politics and the real jargon of it, but at InGenius, we do work with many international students. So, what would you say to those students right now? How do we, as educators and advisors, help them navigate this anxiety?
There's probably a few things I would say. At the highest level, the way that I understand this is that it is more of a perceptual issue than it is a practical issue, in the sense that the perception of Donald Trump doing something like this is that the United States is not especially welcoming to international students. Now, of course, that's not true really generally at all, much less at these institutions. But it doesn't exactly set the stage for a positive interpretation of study abroad to the United States. That's the sort of perceptual issue. On a practical basis, much of the things that Trump does, and this is not just true now, but has always been true in his first administration as well, is make dramatic moves that garner huge headlines that ultimately have no impact on the ground. That is to say, very little changes. And the reason why is because most of these dramatic changes aren't legal. So in the case of the revocation of SEVP certification, there are any number of reasons that this cannot be done. The first is that there's a pretty clear statute that governs revocation of certification. The bottom line is the Department of Homeland Security needs to have cause in order to revoke certification. It can't just allege something randomly. and then revoke it. And the administration hasn't even alleged something that would rise to the occasion, even if it were true, of revoking certification. On top, you pile on top of that the fact that this is a pretty obvious First Amendment violation, Harvard's right to free speech and expression. And I don't know any legal scholar who thinks that this is actually going to get enforced. And indeed, the fact that an injunction was issued almost instantaneously is evidence of how flimsy the government's case is. So practically speaking, my view on what is likely to happen is there's some anxiety and uncertainty that exists for some period of time. And then much like Trump's earlier attempts this year to squeeze universities by revoking visas is ultimately overturned by courts and disappears. That doesn't actually address the emotional issue. If you are an international student studying at Harvard and you've now been told that your visa is going to be revoked, or you've just gotten into Harvard and you're supposed to go there and you're not sure if they can issue a visa, that doesn't exactly comfort you because it's not a guarantee. The reality is that the granting of visas is never really a guarantee. The reality is, for the time being, the legal situation is that Harvard still has the ability to grant visas. That is unlikely to change. And the most important thing that students can do right now is not panic and make any sudden movements. My recommendation for students, if you're at Harvard, if you're about to graduate, graduate. There's nothing going to happen before that. But if you are still in Harvard, you have a couple more years, or you're going there, my advice to you is it's worthwhile to have a plan B, to look into transferring. If you're applying to college, it's certainly worthwhile to consider multiple countries. I would say probably half of our international students consider the US and then usually the UK, sometimes Canada. But I would say it's mostly for peace of mind than anything else. I don't actually think that there's going to be anything meaningfully different. So don't take any sudden action. Maybe look into a plan B, but I wouldn't be trying to transfer right now until this was actually dealt with. It's very unlikely that it's going to be disruptive to your education.
From your perspective, how does this decision affect the trust, not just in Harvard, but in the US higher education overall? How do you think universities should respond?
So it definitely doesn't affect it positively. I think that we have a lot more families who are asking questions about, should we just apply to the UK or should we just apply to Canada? And it's tough because the US remains the only country where you can apply to a full list of schools, all of which are top ranked global institutions. But the point is that the reason that the US is the primary destination, it's much more expensive as a destination than others countries. But the reason is both that it has the largest volume of top ranked institutions and because it has access to the American job market, which is still the largest economy in the world. And so this kind of runs counter to that, right? Which the question is, how welcome are the students? What I would say is that international students are probably more welcome now in college towns and at universities than they have ever been. And the correct move from the institutions themselves, and Harvard has actually been doing a good job of this, if you've read any of their news releases, their press releases, and the posts that they have up on their website, of making clear that international students are really the lifeblood of higher education, and that a lot of not just the funding for these institutions comes from international students, but a lot of key roles in labs, in research, and then also in our technology sector, and our economy are absolutely reliant on international students. I read something this morning that said something like 80,000 immigrants are granted H-1B visas for the tech industry in California alone every single year. That's a lot. You can't just replace that. There aren't enough native-born Americans to fill that void. And so it's not just universities, but the economy that is extremely reliant on these students. And so I think that the message to take away is that, just like with the first administration with Trump, is that Trump doesn't really represent the opinion of the majority of Americans. He really doesn't. This is not a popular policy to be going after these schools. It is a very small rural and nativist population who thinks that it is a good idea to go after, frankly, the beacon of American higher education and of American sort of hegemony, to use a technical term, worldwide. In any event, I think that the universities should be spending their time and energy explaining to the world that they are not just reliant, but also extremely welcoming to international students, and that the United States remains a place where people can change their life, where they can learn from the world's experts, where they can get jobs that they wouldn't have otherwise have access to, and where they can stay, learn, and live after they've graduated.
I kind of want to talk about the legal piece of this now, because your background in law gives you like a unique perspective here. Legally speaking, how strong is this case against this move? What are the likely outcomes in court?
I think it's important to understand what SEVP is. It's essentially a database where upon granting an F1 visa to a student, a institution needs to register them in this database that lets us know, okay, how many foreign students are studying in the United States? What are they studying? Where are they studying? All of that. The regulations concerning SEVP certification and revocation are pretty clearly laid out. And there are a predefined set of standards under which the Department of Homeland Security can force an institution to withdraw. Now, some of those are obvious. If an institution loses its accreditation, it can no longer get access to the database, to the system. If a university is fraudulently applying for F1 visas for students who aren't really students, they can lose certification. Under no circumstances is it articulated that an institution can have its certification revoked if, for example, it is not handling its problems on campus adequately, right? So the administration alleges that this is because of Harvard's failure to respond to anti-Semitism, which is in and of itself a reprehensible issue, but not actually related in any way to F1 visas and the SEVP. So that's one issue. The Department of Homeland Security is alleged that they had requested information from Harvard that Harvard refused, and at the time had said, if you don't do this, you are going to be considered voluntarily withdrawn from this database. And Harvard refused to provide that information. The statutes that in question also provide a very clear list of what information the institutions are required to provide. Harvard did provide that information. It didn't provide more information. So just on the statutory basis alone, it's a non-starter. There isn't really anything in there that seems to be at issue. The other kind of issue here is whether or not this is a violation of the First Amendment, both a violation of retaliation for Harvard exercising its free speech, and also an attempt to stifle that free speech. I think that argument from a constitutional perspective, from what I've read, I'm far from a constitutional expert or scholar, but from what I've read, that's a pretty clear-cut case. The most legal experts and lawyers think that this is open and shut. It's not a very good case for the government. It's a very flimsy case. And I don't think that would come as a surprise to the government itself. I don't think that they're doing this under the expectation that it is upheld. They are doing it under the expectation that it causes enough disruption quickly enough that Harvard complies regardless of whether or not it's a good case. Now, perhaps they didn't anticipate there being an injunction issued immediately, which kind of throws a wrench in their plans. But ultimately, I think that this is less about them believing it's going to be upheld in the same way that like pulling visas from students who had traffic violations earlier this year, which by the way also has a nationwide injunction on it now. They don't think that this is going to be upheld. They don't think that these students are going to actually be removed. They just think it will cause enough panic and chaos that institutions comply before the courts can get the order in place. And I think that this administration on the whole, the kind of rule recently has been they grossly underestimate the courts. They've clearly not understood how difficult it is to push these things fast enough that courts can't interfere. And so it is all these headlines about what Trump and their administration is planning, followed by a whole bunch of really rapid court rulings that basically make it impossible for them to continue doing it. And that's part of the reason that we have three branches of government, is so that they check each other. And this is a great example of that.
So, as our final question, for students and families listening right now who feels really anxious or even have this sense of hopelessness, what message would you want them to hear right now, or any hope or reassurance that we can offer?
Firstly, I'm so sorry that you're dealing with this. And frankly, I'm embarrassed that it's happening in the United States, which is not a country that I thought would ever have to be dealing with these kinds of issues. They're foolish. What I would tell you is that from an institutional perspective and from a national perspective and from an economic perspective, the United States is actually more pro-international students than really it ever has been. This is the product of a very specific vendetta against Harvard in particular. I don't think that there's much probability that it expands beyond Harvard. I think that this is just short-sighted policy in an attempt to bully a generally great institution. So I think that's terrible. I don't think you should panic. I think that you should remember all of the other times that there were big headlines about things that Trump was doing, followed by an immediate backtracking. Everything he does is this way. From the trade war in 2018, COVID policies, Tariffs, how quickly did we go from global economic meltdown to him basically walking back the entire thing? The nature of Trump, and I can say this as somebody who's been through both administrations in a position dealing with a lot of international education, the nature of Trump is that the headlines always belie the reality. And the reality is very little changes on the ground, despite a lot of language to the contrary. So I would stay calm. If you're not going to Harvard, I really don't think that this is something that you need to be worried about. If you are going to Harvard, I also don't really think that this is something that you need to be panicked about. But just for safety's sake, I would recommend looking into other options. Like we launching a scholarship program, if not today, then tomorrow, for Harvard students who want to look into transferring. We're not going to help anybody transfer until it's actually necessary. We don't think that people need to be scared into paying things that isn't really required. But if people want to investigate it, we'll certainly help them do that. But ultimately, I would say not much has changed, not much will change. And to those families who are considering studying in the United States but haven't yet applied, what I would tell you is this: none of these things make it feel more attractive. That's undoubted. That's undoubtedly the case. From one perspective, I would say the fact that these kinds of policies are likely to deter other families, there will probably be a few years, maybe only a year, in which there is some greater amount of opportunity to study at these institutions because they'll probably, almost certainly, international applications to Harvard will decline this next year. I don't think anybody expects anything else. And what that means is that there'll be more opportunity in the short term. So I think that's the silver lining here. The other side of this is I think it's important to pay attention to the people and the institutions that matter. What you care about coming to the United States is you care about the institutions themselves, the colleges, the university, the graduate schools. You care about the employers. You care about the communities that you are a part of. I grew up in a college town. I spent 12 years living in New Haven next to Yale. These are areas that love their international students and that need them. And so this is not an unwelcoming environment. This is a place where if you want to have what generations before you have had studying in the United States, it's still very much available to you.
That's some great advice to end this episode. Thank you, Joel, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Best of luck, everyone, and stay calm.
And that's it for today's episode. We know that this is a very stressful and uncertain time, especially for international students right now in the US, really navigating the admissions process. But remember, you're not alone. We're here to walk it with you. If this conversation brought up questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out. You can find more resources, expert advice, and support at ingeniusprep.com, or just shoot me an email. All the links will be in the description box below. And thank you all for listening. Just remember, stay informed and stay calm. And we'll see you in the next episode.